I found so many lookalikes. I grew up in a small community in southern Bavaria, Germany. There were only 8 other kids in my age group, so the school had to slap together several classes into one. This was the countryside, where people had to band together to clear the streets in the winter. We made do. I remember the day I left to study at the university. We had to cover the road in pine branches and gravel to get some kind of friction, as the car tires kept sliding on the ice. 3 of our neighbors were out there, all helping to push and cheer. I barely made it to the train before the doors closed. By some strange twist of fate, I ended up next to a girl from the class above me, Alice. Alice came from a big family. 8 siblings, none of them born more than a year apart. You'd be excused for mistaking one of them for another. But Alice was special. Every girl wanted to be like her, myself included. Not only was she pretty, but she was ambitious. Brilliant even. She could talk her way out of everything, and people were lining up to help her with whatever project she made up. She was the most likely of us to succeed according to, well, everyone. I ended up next to her on the train. We barely knew each other. We had never really talked. But we were heading for something greater, and we wore our nerves on our sleeves. And there was one curious detail we had in common: our necklaces. It was a small amber-colored stone encircled by a silver disc, marked with 12 distinct notches, like a clock or the months of the year. I noticed it, and Alice did too. "We got the same one," she said. "Where'd you get it?" "I think Emma makes them," I said. "She tricked my mom into buying one. Weird how Emma doesn't wear one of her own. They're kinda dumb." I just blurted it out, but it got a laugh out of her. Alice always seemed so composed, but for that one moment she was just like me. I didn't see Alice for a long time after that. I studied photojournalism. I wanted to be the next Niedringhaus or Kempkins. I fell in love with my camera and a man and moved to the big city to live a metropolitan life. I ran into a whole bunch of almosts. I almost got married. I almost became a mother. I almost got a promotion. But that whole box of almost fell out the window, and I ended up without anything. Not even my camera. Alice, on the other hand, was on the up and up. She entered a talent show under the name Dorothea. She got pretty far too. It was impressive in a way. I couldn't hear her Bavarian accent anymore. After the show ended, she became a presenter on a local morning show. Nothing big, and I don't even know if anyone watched it, but she was there. After a series of bad choices, I decided to move back to my old town. I got a place near Rothenburg ob der Tauber and did some side work for a small government office. But after downsizing, I was once again left without a plan. This whole story started with the dumbest thing: a selfie. I was standing outside a cafe and took a selfie when I noticed someone in the background. Alice, or Dorothea. I barely recognized her with her darkened hair and muted colors. I turned around and got a proper picture of her since I already had my phone up. I was going to send it to my mom just to say, "Look who I saw today." A couple seconds later, she turned around and noticed me, phone in hand. She raised an eyebrow and walked up to me. "Can I help you?" she asked. "You're Alice," I said. "From school." "Alice?" she said. "Haven't heard that in a while." "Yeah, you were a class ahead of me. We had the same necklace." Her hand immediately shot up to her neck, where I noticed her still wearing that same necklace. The amber stone, the silver disc. And for a moment, I could see her as that ambitious young woman again. She had that same fire. And I realized that even now, years later, I could see why people wanted to be her. "Why did you take my picture?" she asked. "Sorry, I was just It was a surprise to see you, I said. Is that okay? Yes, of course, she smiled. Do you take a lot of pictures? I used to, I admitted. But you can't make much money with a phone camera. She gave me a long, curious look. She considered something, crossing her arms. She looked back on the cafe, then at me. I think she could tell my phone was a couple of years out of date. We should talk, she said. Catch up. We had a small lunch. Well, I did. She'd already had hers. I told her about my recent misfortunes and she listened patiently. There wasn't much to say about her life. It had been the talk of the town, and most of us knew her story one way or another. She was well aware. If you're looking for work, I got something I'm working on, she said. And I could use someone I can trust. Really? What's it about? It's rather personal, she sighed. But all expenses paid. I don't know, Alice, I dash. It's Thea now, she corrected. If that's okay. Of course, yeah, I nodded. Sure. She sent me her contact info, and we decided to meet at her place later that night. Now, for those who don't know, Rothenburg has a quite peculiar architecture. Walking along those streets after being away for so long feels like stepping back in time. The medieval-like cobblestone streets are lined with traditional Germanic houses. There's even a stone wall. It's not all medieval, of course, but it really sets a different tone. Coming home from a larger city, it didn't just feel like I was back where I belonged. It felt like going back in time. Alice lived a bit on the outskirts. If you follow one of the residential roads far enough, you get to a turnabout that splits into two. One road leads to a private property, lined with a waist-high metal fence and spotlights with movement detectors. A bit further in is a surprisingly large one-story building. A somewhat modern yellow house with white square windows and a tall gray A-shaped roof, complete with a garden on the east side. It was too cold to grow anything now, but a tired fountain still puttered water from the stone of two wrestling cherubs. Alice greeted me by the door long before I knocked. She was eager to see me, and I could tell she was a bit more comfortable now. Maybe she didn't like being seen in public. I hadn't considered just how rude I'd been, taking pictures of her when she's out minding her own business. She invited me in and offered me a Tegernsee. I settled for some coffee. I was surprised to see how sparingly decorated her house was. Maybe she wasn't making as much money as I thought. That, and I had no idea she lived alone. I'd heard rumors of her dating. We sat down in her living room as she pushed a little black bag towards me. I recognized the brand immediately. I could tell what kind of camera it was before opening it. Figures you're good with a camera, she said. You want me to take your picture? I asked. I can take pretty good portraits. No, she laughed. No, not my picture. It's a long story, but hear me out. Not only did Alice grow up in a big family, apparently it was even bigger. Turns out Alice had a different father than 4 of her other siblings, and some stayed with the other parent. All in all, it was a group of 12 kids, some whom she grew up with, some which she didn't. I moved back here to reconnect with that side of the family, she said. I only learned of them recently. Must have been a shock, I said. I can't imagine. And that's only half of it. She grabbed her coffee cup and put it to her lips, but it burned her. She put it down, keeping her composure. Apparently, I have a twin sister, she continued, and she lives around these parts. As Alice explained it, her sister had been forced to stay with the father as part of a divorce settlement. But she didn't know her name and thought she might have gotten married, thus changing her last name. She'd contacted city officials and everyone in her family, but to no avail. The only lead she had was that this woman, her twin, still lived somewhere in the region. I think she works in a bakery or a cafe, Alice continued. A friend of a friend swore they saw her at a booth at the Christmas market. So what do you need me for? I want you to help me find her, she said. I want you to do just like what you did with me, to look for her. And if you find someone who even remotely looks like her, take a picture and come back to me. Sounds a bit far-fetched, I added. There's a lot of bakeries and even more cafes. I will pay you very generously, she said. All equipment. Yes. Anything. I just need an eye out there so I can focus on other things without feeling like I'm abandoning the idea of her. She took my hand and I saw the necklace jingle back and forth. There was an honest plea in her voice. But then again, she was media trained and an aspiring actress. I don't care if it's just a glimpse, she continued. I just want to know she's real. We worked out the details over the next few days. I was given whatever equipment I asked for. The only thing she insisted on was that I keep all pictures, no matter how bad they were. That, and that I didn't approach this woman. That could be unnerving. It was simple enough, and I only had to check in with a phone call a day to say what places I visited. Alice wasn't picky. For the first few days, I lolled around town taking pictures of anything and anyone that even remotely looked like her. It was a dud though. No one really stood out. I tried a couple cafes and a bakery or two, but no one that worked there really looked like her. That is, until I checked a place in the next town over to the west. There was a chilling rain in the air that morning, on the border between snow and sleet. Warm enough to make you sweat, but cold enough to freeze your hands. Miserable. I found a small corner cafe with a cartoonish carrot mascot on the front. There, sweeping the floor, was a woman that was almost identical to Alice. She had slightly shorter hair and was a bit taller, but I figured that was just a matter of perspective. It had to be her, so I started taking pictures. But no matter how hard I tried, I just couldn't get it right. It was always slightly out of frame, or she managed to duck behind something at the worst time. Out of almost 100 pictures, I couldn't get a single one without a bit of blur. So I called Alice to ask if I should get her name and number. Alice was quick to respond, but I could tell she was busy with something. Absolutely not, she whispered. Just a couple of pictures and I'll see about calling her. I'm not getting anything good, I said. I'm not used to this kind of dash. Don't worry, Alice interrupted. Just get what you can and meet me tonight. Coming back to Alice's place, I was eager to share my findings. She offered me a tegernsir, but I settled for a coffee again. I sipped it as she browsed the pictures. She sighed, shaking her head. It's not her, she said. You can see it on the neck and ears. And the height. You sure? I asked. The pictures aren't very clear. I'm sure, she said. I'm sorry. No, I understand, I said. I can look elsewhere. Could you? Alice smiled. Would you mind? Not at all. Alice slipped the memory card out of the camera and put it aside with an implied, just in case, and kept me company as I finished my coffee. What was the odds of there being another woman who looked like her in this region, who wasn't her twin? Astronomical. About a week later, I spotted another woman at a cafe who was almost identical. She had natural blonde hair and her cheeks were a bit rounder, but that was it. I took some pictures and observed. I wasn't as preoccupied this time, but I noticed that I still couldn't get a good picture. I could get one of the other patrons, but not of that particular woman. It's as if the camera itself hated her. It made me question whether it was my skills or just her. How come everyone else turned out so well? Cameras don't play favorites. They just show the world as is. So what was it trying to tell me? I looked at those blurry faces long enough for the cafe to close. I watched the woman leave and couldn't help myself. I had to see what was going on, so I followed her. She walked a spiraling road out of town and took a shortcut through the forest. Somewhere along that shortcut I lost her. I scanned the area with my camera in hand, but it was getting dark. Then I spotted her. She was just standing there off the side of the road, looking straight ahead, seemingly paralyzed. She said nothing, did nothing. It's as if she had stopped pretending. My phone buzzed. My head flipped down and I almost dropped my camera. Thank God for the backup straps. Looking back up, she turned my way. Her neutral expression soured as she noticed my camera. "No pictures," she called out. "Sorry," I said. "I'll go." "No," she repeated. I said, "No pictures." "I'm sorry," I said. For a moment we just stood there looking at one another. Then she burst into a sprint. I ran as fast as I could, but I hadn't run in years. She apparently had. She was far faster than I'd anticipated. It took her less than a minute to catch up to me. She grunted like an animal as she swiped at me, before finally catching the camera strap. She tried to pull it off me, but the strap broke. The camera sailed away, landing bottom side down on a sharp rock, splitting the storage latch wide open and crunching the bottom of the memory card. I fell forward, scraping the palms of my hands. I covered my head and hurried back up to my feet, only to realize she was gone. Looking back on the trail, there was no one there. I was just standing there, panting like a dog for nothing. I looked down at my camera, who'd taken a far worse beating than me. The memory card was broken and the screen was cracked. I wouldn't have anything to show Alice. Wherever that woman went, she could rest well knowing that whatever picture I had of her was broken along with my camera. I met Alice later that night and explained what had happened. She was concerned and handed me some paper towels to wash my hands. Alice didn't seem bothered by the camera at all. She could just get me another one. Instead, she wanted to focus our efforts elsewhere. Apparently, she wasn't a natural blonde, so this woman couldn't possibly have been her twin. I had no idea that Alice had faked it all these years. As I was about to leave, I threw one of the paper towels away, only to notice something in her trash can. A memory card, just like the one I'd handed her earlier. She'd broken it in two and thrown it away. I didn't mention it. Maybe she had her reasons. But what worried me was what those reasons might be. This continued for a couple more weeks. I would find someone with a similar look and I'd fail to get a clear picture. If I stuck around, I would notice strange behavior. One of them just sat in a car for hours, staring straight ahead as if pretending to drive. Another just wandered around town aimlessly, waving at people. Another just stood at a crossing looking at cars. I would find at least one of them every week and they'd follow similar patterns. They would never sleep. I never once saw them sleeping, they just kept wandering around or doing things. They hated being photographed, so I kept well out of sight and kept my phone muted. They never seemed to talk with people for long. They didn't smoke or drink or eat, and they never showed any real emotion. It's like they weren't really people. They weren't really there. I only mentioned my concerns to Alice once. "You seem to have a lot of doppelgangers," I mentioned. "I've never considered how many people there are who look like you." "Don't use that word," she murmured. "Excuse me?" "I told you," she repeated. "Don't use that word. It's an ugly word." "I was just making an observation," I said. "Well, make a better one," she sighed. I'm not here to entertain your imagination. All the while she didn't raise her voice. She didn't lose her composure. Calm as a lake and poised as a princess. The one we all aspired to be still. And with every meeting, I noticed the stack of broken memory cards grow. I had to travel pretty far to find my next target. Far enough to have to catch an overnight stay at a hotel. I'd been looking at various bakeries all day when I returned to the hotel, stopping briefly in the lobby to brush the thick rain from my eyes. That's when I heard a voice. "Don't tell me," the voice said. "Do I know you?" I turned around. It was a woman with short curly blonde hair and far too much eyeshadow. She had a jolly face underlined by her well-trained arms. It took me a couple of seconds to connect the dots. She wasn't an exact copy, but I could tell she had a lot of similarities to Alice. "I met you on the train," she smiled. "We had the same necklace." I just looked at her, flabbergasted. There was no way she could have known that. "Alice?" I asked. "Yes," she laughed. "I knew it." We ended up talking for a bit. Her move to the big city had turned into disaster just like mine. She eventually gave up and came back to marry her teenage sweetheart. Now she had 3 kids and worked in the hotel kitchen. She couldn't stop talking about her family and was eager to show me pictures. She had 100 questions and I tried to answer them all. We talked for hours. There was no doubt in my mind that this woman was Alice. She knew everything about our time growing up, the teachers we had, the rumors and fates of those we used to know. She offered me a pastry from the kitchen, free of charge. We had 2 each. Before we went our separate ways, I asked her for a picture. She didn't mind at all and asked me to send it to her. It came out perfectly. "I just wish I still had that necklace," she sighed. "It got stolen years ago." It was funny in a way. She didn't turn out the way I thought she would, but I still envied her. Even there and then I could see people wanting to be her. What a joy of a person. Going back to my hotel room, I sat with my phone in hand, considering my options. Dorothea would want to know this, but how would she react? She'd been rigid about me not talking to the twin. I was just supposed to take pictures. Besides, this woman wasn't her sister. She was outright claiming to be her. Someone wasn't telling the truth and I wasn't seeing the whole picture. And maybe that was the answer. A picture tells 1,000 words and maybe I hadn't looked close enough. Looking back at that first picture I took of Dorothea, I noticed something in her expression. When she turned around, she wasn't flustered or curious. She was scared. Terrified even. That expression wasn't of someone who'd been surprised. It was of someone afraid to die. I turned my concerns in and out, and one word kept coming back to me. One word that she didn't like. Doppelganger. The people I'd taken pictures of never ate, drank, or slept. And thinking back on it, I'd never seen Dorothea do those things either. At the cafe, she claimed to have just eaten. Every time I'd been at her place, she'd either put her coffee aside or drank nothing. In fact, that would explain why she always had the same bottle of Tegernseer to offer. She had one herself. But did she sleep? It might all be circumstantial. Maybe I was missing something. But as I turned the picture of the real Alice over and over in my hands, the thought dawned on me like a spike of ice running down my spine. I might not have talked to a real person. I was up late that night, scouring the web for whatever snippets of truth I could find. I looked for what I already knew, trying to find something related to it. People that only pretended to be people. Among the myriads of conspiracy theories, there were a couple of people talking about doppelgangers. Some even mentioned similar signs as I'd noticed. There was one post about a man who claimed to be followed by one. I swear he stole my shoe and ran off, a post read. Haven't seen him since. You need to get that back, someone answered. They get more real the more things they steal from you. They'll try to replace you, another wrote. Or worse, kill you. There was so much about them, but it was hard to sift through. Most of it was nonsense. One claimed they couldn't attack people who invested in crypto. Another claimed they were actually angels. But a few statements had not only a lot of people agreeing, but others joining in to correlate their findings. One such claim was that the doppelgangers hated one another and would compete to be the only remaining copy. But the most important discussion was how to destroy them. Apparently, breaking a picture of a doppelganger would also break the creature itself. My mind drifted back to the cracked memory cards in Dorothea's trash can, and the disappearing lady who'd chased me. It doesn't work on the good ones, a final post mentioned. If they have taken something from you, you can barely tell them from the real thing. And you can't break their picture. I barely got any sleep that night. My head was spinning and my mind kept drifting back to what I'd seen. I tried to put it together. Around midnight I got a text message from my employer, and my worries settled in my gut. You got something for me? She texted. I'll come by tomorrow, I wrote back. See you then. Before I turned my phone off, I scrolled to her number. I bit my lip as I changed her contact information from Alice to Dorothea. I didn't know what to expect when I came to see her the next day, but I had my eyes open. She stood in the doorway as always, welcoming me. I tried to keep a straight face, but it didn't feel genuine. I think she noticed. You all right? She asked. Dorothea had gotten rid of at least a dozen other doppelgangers, thanks to my pictures. It was only a matter of time before they had something to say about it. A handful of them emerged from the woods. If I'd been a little more observant, I would have noticed them long ago. A car following me. People watching me from afar. Hell, the spotlights who stayed on as I entered Dorothea's house. Just as I'd watched them, they'd done an effort to watch. Long day, I said. Sorry. We stepped inside. No wonder the place looked so pristine. She wasn't using it. Some of her kitchen appliances still had protective plastic. Her bed was in perfect order, and I could tell there was a thin layer of dust on the bedside table. Dorothea offered me a Tegernseer, but I declined. I declined the coffee too. She raised an eyebrow at that as we sat down in the living room. So, she said, what have you found? I think I found the right one, I said. The picture came out perfectly. She didn't really look like you though. Really now? She turned to me fully, giving me complete attention. She held out her left hand. I raised the camera. What are you going to do? I asked. I'm going to speak to my sister, she smiled. Now hand me the camera. Are you both named Alice? Her smile never faded. She leaned back a little, her face stuck in that same unsettling glare, like the eyes of a porcelain doll. She did not blink. Did you speak to her? She asked. You didn't answer my question. I have no obligation to, she responded. You work for me. You're nothing like I remember you, I said. Isn't that strange? People change, my friend. I leaned back in my chair, putting the camera away. You have no memory of meeting me on that train, do you? She didn't respond. That's why you didn't recognize me, I continued. You don't know. The camera, if you would. Just tell me honestly, I said. If not Alice, then who are you? Maybe I'm my own person, she said, leaning a little closer. Now how about you be a good friend, and hand me the fucking camera? I slid it across the table and got up from my chair. She immediately turned it on, noticing that the memory card was empty. I'd switched them earlier. I snapped a picture of her with my phone, bathing the room in a sudden flash. She clutched the necklace around her neck, but the picture came out perfect. "So that's it then," I said. "That's how you pass as normal. Maybe you should learn to mind your own business," she said. "Maybe you don't know what you're getting yourself into. Maybe I don't like being taken advantage of." I snapped back. "Maybe I don't want to bloody my hands handing over a victim to a dash." "To a what?" She got up from her chair, letting the camera roll across the floor. She looked at me from across the room, unblinking, her lungs still. She had stopped pretending. "To a what exactly?" she repeated. I looked at this thing from across the room. I'd seen her with that same smile on TV. She'd been clever and tried to make herself into a new person. But Dorothea was something different, and she knew that I knew. It dawned on me that she might not let me leave. I backed away, keeping my phone raised. "Doppelganger," I whispered. "You should have swallowed that fucking word," she growled. Instead of spitting it at me. Without facing away from me, she pressed her fingers into the wall. They were so hard and sharp, like stone, tearing long lines in the wallpaper. "But no," she continued. "You get to be who you want. You're duller than a butter knife. You couldn't dream bigger than taking pictures of lamps, streets, or of people better than you. You're not better than me." I snapped back. "And you're definitely not people." She made this awful sound, like she inhaled through a straw and never stopped. An inwards breath turned screech as she tore through whatever she could get her hands on. And even then, her face never changed from that serene smile. But everything I felt from her was this boundless disgust. I threw myself out the door and took a sharp left, running through her garden. Dorothea was so distracted that she almost kept heading straight, but she managed to spot me before I turned the corner. She came after me like a thunderstorm. I rushed past the little signs of her budding garden. I trampled right on through, but so did she. I leapt over her waist-high fence, snagging my coat on one of the iron spikes, but I let it tear. Dorothea leapt over it like she was made of nothing, sliding across the sleet like a swan settling on a lake. There was a slope leading down to a patch of sparse pine trees. She was gaining on me. I took a sharp left as Dorothea slipped, tumbling down the slope, clawing at the ground as I gained some distance. Then she stopped. For a moment I did too, looking down on her from the top of the slope. She wiped the sleet-covered hair from her face, then turned away from me. We weren't alone. I should have known. Me. And I'd lead them right to her. Just as she was vicious and clever, so were they. They spoke their own language. Short, spit-like words with harsh consonants. They circled her like sharks. Dorothea in turn pointed at me, but they weren't buying it. Then cold steel. Something pressing against my throat. "Walk." They wrestled her to the ground like a herd of cats, scratching and tearing at one another. They tore chunks of her hair and she didn't even blink. A snake pit of tattered clothes and neutral faces. At the end of it, she was on her knees, held by 3 others who could have been her sisters. An arm reached out from my side and held up my phone. I heard a twang as her necklace was torn off and thrown to the ground. "Take her picture," one of them whispered in my ear. "Now." They held my arm straight, making sure I couldn't use it on anyone else. I pressed my finger to the screen, taking her picture. Her face was blurred. Her movements staggered and strange. A living smudge. A half-person. A colorful shadow at best. Dorothea looked up at me, her face as neutral as ever. But somewhere in that picture I could see her hatred. Not in a grimace or expression, but in the whirling impressions left on the screen. The steel pressed closer to my neck. "Break it," they whispered. She cheated. She skipped the line. And so I dropped my phone to the ground and cracked it with the heel of my boot. There was no drama. No explosion or screams. Dorothea simply disappeared like a silent, popped balloon. A whiff of air lost in the wind. Nothing returned to nothing, leaving a handful of belongings behind. A coat. Some pants. No shoes. The doppelgangers clawed at her things, trying to get to the torn necklace. The one at my throat was distracted and let their composure slip. For a second I could act. They hissed at one another, muttering their spit-like words, trying to convince each other to let the necklace go. But I remembered something. Dorothea had called me several times. She had a phone. I dropped to my knees and tapped her right coat pocket. I was lucky. My fingers slipped her phone out of her pocket and I rolled onto my back. I held the phone up like a shield. My attacker recoiled, covering their face with their hands. The others hurried back, hiding behind trees, bushes, and each other. I held the phone towards them, hoping they wouldn't realize I hadn't unlocked it. That I couldn't take their pictures even if I wanted to. My heart was hammering so fast, hoping against hope that they wouldn't figure it out. "I got you all," I said. "I got you all and I can break this." They said nothing. Little shrieks as they lowered their heads, leaning forward like playful cats. "You think you can break it before we get you?" one of them whispered. "You think so?" another chimed in. "Are you sure?" I stepped forward and they recoiled. It was all talk. But a few of them were moving away, circling me. They wanted to find an angle. Even if they didn't attack, they might notice that I wasn't recording. I had to act fast. "I'm keeping this," I said. "And if I see any one of you, I'm breaking it. I'm walking out of here. We'll never talk again and no one dies." There was no response. I backed away, watching their doll faces peeking out from behind the trees. Spitting hisses at one another like snake bites turned word. They were discussing, but not moving. And they let me go. Now this was a couple of years ago. Some things have happened and some things haven't. Even today you might see Dorothea on TV. I've changed the name for anonymity, as you might have noticed. I think one of them stole something or possibly fixed the necklace and took her place. The real Alice still lives with her family. I've checked. She's okay. Things turned around for me not long after that. I got a job with a news agency. I think the new Dorothea had something to do with it, as it had come with a recommendation. Maybe she figured keeping me happy might keep me from breaking that phone. Or maybe they just wanted me distracted. Or maybe it wasn't them at all. I've since made a bit of a name for myself. Nothing big, but enough to get by. I've met a man and I've moved to a bigger place. We got a dog and I can honestly say I'm happy. If anything, I can imagine others wishing they were me for once. But I wanted to share this story for a reason, and I think others need to pay attention too. About a month ago I came home to a bouquet of flowers sitting on my doorstep. Mostly white roses, but a handful of blue sunflowers as well. And a little note. "I got one of your earrings," it said. It was signed with a smiley. As I turned around and looked across the street, I noticed someone looking back. It was almost like looking in a mirror. My hair, my nose, my smile. Like me, but a little bit different.